An introduction to Bizet's Carmen. To ask you if any opera in the repertory has a more thrilling opening than that one. Sir Rudolph Bing, long-time general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, used to say that selling opera is as easy as ABC, Aida, Bohème and Carmen. Carmen is one of those masterworks, immensely popular, an indispensable part of the international repertory, an operatic smash hit, which was a total disaster at its first performance. This is a fate it shares with Madama Butterfly, The Barber of Seville, and a few other now popular crowd-pleasers. But more of that later. More important is to note that Carmen succeeds in being both an enormous crowd-pleaser for audiences of every level of operatic sophistication, a favourite performing role for singers, and every conductor's delight with its wonderful tunes and vibrant orchestration. If stage directors are less enthusiastic, it is because Carmen is a strenuous work which makes them work hard, staging a great deal of complex action. This quality of being equally admired by experts and lay people alike is maybe the best definition of a true masterwork, which should speak to everyone in some way or other. Before we return to that first night of Carmen in March of 1875, which may or may not have contributed to the composer's early death just 3 months later, we need to look at some of Bizet's earlier achievements, if only to disabuse ourselves of the notion that he was a one-work composer. There are such people, and the French seem particularly adept at producing them. Dukas of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Ibert of Divertissement fame, and Chabrier, remembered mainly for his Espagne, all pop into mind. Bizet was born in 1838 in Paris, and is remembered in the theatre for 3 operas. First, The Pearl Fishers, which has perhaps the loveliest duet ever written for tenor and baritone. And La Jolie Fille de Perth, The Fair Maid of Perth, one of a large number of operas written on themes from Sir Walter Scott's Waverley novels. The best known is Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. In the old days it was usual to have a pit orchestra in playhouses to provide background music, often called incidental music, much as we have movie scores nowadays. Bizet's sparkling score to La Lésienne is remembered long after the play for which it was written has disappeared. And even more interesting provenance, as the antique dealers say, attaches to his early Symphony in C, which was written in 1855, when the composer was only 17, lost for generations, and only rediscovered and given its premiere in 1935. It has all the fire and youthful verve of the boy composer who would grow up to write Carmen. Bizet's career showed early promise as a composer and as a pianist, but his work for the theatre had its ups and downs. He never claimed to be a great revolutionary, but he did set out to do something unusual with Carmen, and perhaps that was the cause of its early disastrous reception. The reason it was a disaster was primarily because it was, as we would say nowadays, very much on the cutting edge. When you think about it, for art to advance, it has to be daring, And daring works of art often offend conservative audiences who, then as now, made up the bulk of the opera and concert-going public. One has only to recall the reaction to the premiere of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. It literally led to rioting, to be reminded of this fact. You could say the 1870s was an age in which women were expected to be the gentler sex, and the male chauvinist audience did not take kindly to a heroine markedly more intelligent and forceful than any of the men around her. Another problem facing the piece, which was adapted from a novella by Prosper Mérimée, was that it has as its heroine a gypsy. This means something different in mainland Europe than in the rest of the world. You may have had the experience of walking down a street in Rome and hearing the warning cry, "I zingari, I zingari! The gypsies are coming, the gypsies are coming!" They are rebels against conventional bourgeois society, and as such are hardly fit people to grace the opera stage, at least in the opinion of the respectable bourgeois audience of Paris in the 1870s. And it was a respectable audience. Paris had its seamier side, but the Opéra Comique, where Carmen had its premiere, had established a reputation for wholesome family entertainment. And Carmen is many things, but it is not, fortunately, that. In operas of the period, all the dirty deeds take place discreetly, somewhere in the wings or back in the dressing rooms. Haven't you noticed that most of the more interesting events in opera, the battles, the murders and so on, tend to take place when you are in the bar having the glass that refreshes? Not so in Carmen. Knife fights, a riot, and perhaps the most gruesome murder in all opera, the death of Carmen herself, take place before your very eyes. We should return now to that prelude to Carmen and remind ourselves of its exciting opening. Are these the most thrilling 30 seconds in opera? Bizet cleverly and obligingly uses his prelude to introduce us to some of the principal themes of his opera, and it is not long before we meet the theme associated with Escamillo, the Toreador. Next, we hear what is simply the most important musical theme in the opera, that representing fate or destiny. It will be used to represent the fateful influence Don José, our anti-hero, will have upon Carmen. It will be used to represent, to borrow the title of another favourite opera of the period, the force of destiny in human affairs. It is in fact the linchpin of the score, in the way that Don José's infatuation for Carmen is the linchpin of the drama. Let's hear it again. Interestingly, for such an important tune, it is never sung by any of the characters. It is only heard in the orchestra, as if to suggest, perhaps, that fate works independently of human actions. People get very hung up on what is a grand opera, what is an operetta, and so on, and of course the definitions are not all that important. But generally, a grand opera, or grande opéra, is a massive 5-act work written for the Paris Opera and with a mandatory ballet in the 3rd act. Not the 2nd act or the 4th act, the 3rd act, because that was the time when the gentlemen of the Jockey Club chose to arrive at the theatre, just in time to admire the legs of the ballet ladies. Even Wagner and Verdi had to add ballets to their operas to get them performed in Paris. Othello with ballet. Sacre bleu! Opera comique, or Singspiel in German, has spoken dialogue, and some very great composers wrote majestic works for that form. Mozart's The Magic Flute and Beethoven's Fidelio are among the greatest operas in the repertory, but they are not grand operas in the strictest sense. Neither is Carmen, though fortunately, just after Bizet's death, and to fulfil the terms for the Vienna premiere, his good friend Edouard Giraud set the dialogues to music. Dialogues set to music become recitatives, and it is in that form that Carmen conquered the world. I say fortunately because the sound of opera singers of different nationalities struggling with French dialogue is enough to make Voltaire revolve in his grave. Sing it, as Anna Russell famously said, and you can get away with linguistic murder. This would seem a good opportunity, perhaps, to discuss some of the different voice types you meet in opera, because Bizet uses them very cleverly in Carmen to depict different human types. The highest, the soprano voice, the purest sound, is given to Michaela, the simple peasant girl, to imply her unspoiled nature. In contrast, the warmer, more seductive, more sensual nature of the gypsy woman, Carmen, is represented by the mezzo-soprano. The heroic, dramatic qualities, bordering often on the hysterical, are represented by the dramatic tenor of Don José. And the more overtly masculine sensuality of Escamillo, the Toreador, by the warmer, richer baritone. The opera proper opens in a sun-baked square in Seville, where the soldiers are indulging in some constructive loafing, while watching the comings and goings, le va-et-vient, as the French call it, of the townsfolk. Listen and hear in the orchestra the heat rising off the dusty square as the curtain goes up. The simple peasant girl, Michaela, enters, looking for her former sweetheart, Don José. And the corporal, Morales, has a jaunty, flirtatious little tune as he tells her that José will be here when the guard changes. the comparative peace and quiet of the plaza is broken with the sound of the factory bell as the factory girls enter. It is one of these delectable in-jokes of opera that almost every production has the girls coming out of the factory at this point. But since Carmen will be the last of the cigarette girls to appear, it strains our credulity to believe that her devotion to her job keeps her at her workbench longer than the other girls. It is much more likely that the girls are returning to work after the siesta. In any event, the women of the chorus have a long, languorous cigarette break on stage. The sight of women smoking in public would have been another nail in the bourgeois coffin of the first performance. That said, Bizet brilliantly depicts the sensuality of the warm afternoon air, the forbidden pleasures of the cigarettes, and the smoke languorously curling up into the Mediterranean sky. Carmen has one of the best entrances given to any artist in opera, and very soon after she launches into one of the most famous arias in this or any opera. L'amour est un oiseau rebelle, also and better known as the habanera. The outstanding quality of this aria is that Bizet gives it a chromatic quality. By that we mean that the melody descends in half tones, using, as it were, the black keys on the piano as well as the white. Certainly the result is to create a wonderfully sensuous, sinewy quality. I think Theda Bara and the other vamps of the still-to-be-invented silent cinema learned to smoulder by listening to this aria. This lovely aria has an attractive second theme to the words L'amour est enfant de bohème, using the word bohème in the same sense as it is used in the title of Puccini's opera, bohemian, gypsy-like. Love is a wayward child is maybe the best translation.
L'amour est enfant de bohème, il n'a jamais connu les lois. Si tu ne m'aimes pas, je t'aime. Si je t'aime, prends garde à toi. Si tu ne m'aimes pas, si tu ne m'aimes pas, je t'aime. Et si je t'aime, si je t'aime, prends garde à toi.
In most productions, and interestingly even in prints of the first performance, Don José, the corporal of the guard, is sitting over on stage right, that is, the audience's left, fiddling with his sword buckle, apparently impervious to Carmen's very evident charms. Nothing appeals to Carmen more than a challenge, so she taunts Don José by singing the last couple of verses of the aria at him, not to him, at him, and ends by throwing a flower to him. We have to remember that flower, as it will return to haunt us all in the second act. Pressing on immediately, because this opera is nothing if not action-packed, Michaela, the country sweetheart of Don José, makes a return, and the way Bizet contrasts the earthy sensuality of Carmen with the rustic simplicity of Michaela is quite striking. Listen again to the opening phrases of the duet in which Michaela explains that she has come to see José on behalf of his mother. The music is redolent of the piety and simplicity of both her and Don José's Basque childhood. If you will forgive another digression, opera has a habit of smoothing off the rough edges of a play or novel in the transference to the opera house. Don José is often portrayed as a two-dimensional, rather conventional character, driven mad by passion. In fact, he's a former candidate for the priesthood, which explains why a simple soldier is addressed as Don. And there are even suggestions that he had killed a man and fled to the army to escape justice. Since contrast is the name of this and perhaps of any operatic game, it follows that this domestic interlude will be shattered by the sounds of a riot in the factory. The factory girls come pouring out, shrieking and beating one another black and blue. This scene always presents problems for the stage director, and it is likely that it presented special problems at the first performance and contributed to the failure of the piece at its first outing. The ladies of the chorus of the Opéra Comique, like the chorus of some of our greatest opera houses today, were notorious for their genteel behaviour and for standing around listlessly commenting on the action. When they found they had to move and to sing some rhythmically very tricky music and make at least a stab at dramatic verisimilitude, the result was, and still is, potential chaos. Zuniga, the sergeant of the guard, arrives with some troops in an effort to restore peace, and discovers to no one's surprise that the cause of this breaching of the peace is Carmen, who allegedly started a fight in the factory. She is bound over to keep the peace, quite literally. Her hands are tied behind her back. Zuniga is a pretty tough fellow. But one of the strengths of this opera is that Carmen is the equal or superior of any of the men, not, as we said earlier, an especially popular sentiment in 19th century France. Carmen also has a highly developed sense of humour and has absolutely no time for authority. Now, the French, as we know, have plenty of time for authority. So when Carmen responds to his authoritarian remarks, one of the few parts of the opera where dialogue is still used, and demonstrates her lack of respect for authority in a sweet little tra-la-la tune, it is hard not to find her irresistible.
Avez-vous quelque chose à répondre? Parlez, j'attends.
Tra-la-la-la-la-la-la, coupe-moi, brûlez-moi, je ne te dirai rien. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, je promets tous les feux, le feu et le ciel même.
Zuniga, the cigarette girls, and the troops leave the stage, and leave Don José to guard Carmen. We have the delightful scene now in which Carmen suborns Don José's loyalty. The means by which she does this is a marvellous number called the seguidilla. Listen particularly how the pizzicato, plucked strings in the orchestra, simulate the effect of a guitar. It is easy to imagine that Carmen would be singing this to her own guitar accompaniment, were it not for the fact that her hands are tied behind her back. The words are, Près des remparts de Seville. Close to the ramparts of Seville, my friend Lilas Pastia has a tavern, where I go to dance and sing.
Près des remparts de Séville, chez mon ami Las Pastia, j'irai danser la seguidilla, boire du manzanillo. J'irai chez mon ami Las Pastia. Et s'élance à nu, et les vrais plaisirs sont à deux. Donc, pour me tenir compagnie, j'emmènerai mon amoureux. Mon amoureux, il est au diable. Je l'ai mis à la porte hier. Mon pauvre cœur, très consolable. Mon cœur est libre comme l'air. J'ai des galantes à la douzaine, mais ils ne sont pas à mon gré. Voici la fin de la semaine qui veut m'aimer. Je l'aimerai, qui veut m'en aller t'apprendre. Vous arrivez au moment. Je n'ai guère le temps d'attendre, car avec mon nouvel amant.
Well, this aria, which is unashamedly sung at Don José, is the last straw for the now besotted corporal. He releases Carmen from her bonds, and when Zuniga returns with a warrant, she escapes. Don José, who has been in charge of the prisoner, is very properly arrested in her place, and general laughter, not just at the comedy of the situation, but at the flaunting of authority, listen for the tone of mockery in the orchestra, brings the first act to a rollicking conclusion. There is a short entr'acte now, which means literally between the acts. And the second act opens in the aforementioned Lilas Pastia's tavern. Carmen sets the exotic mood in the opening number. It has always seemed one of life's ironies that much of what we know about the music of Spain is the result of Bizet's wonderfully atmospheric writing, and he never set foot in the country.
De Pascal et le trait, et les guitares forcenées, grosses soudées mais obstinées, mais mes chansons, mais mes refrains, mais mes chansons, mais mes
We learn now that Don José has spent a month in jail for his role in Carmen and the Great Escape, but that he is due to be released from jail that day. But first, we meet the man who will prove to be his nemesis, his fatal rival, the toreador Escamillo. This is one of the very great roles in all opera. It is not a very long role, on the page, as singers say, but the man who can perform it gets to sing some marvellous music, wear dazzling costumes, and generally incarnate the strutting Latin male before an admiring ladies' chorus. Escamillo is welcomed onto the stage with many vivas and olés, so the first thing we hear from him is the great cry of "Votre toast!" I return your salutation, for soldiers and toreros share dangers in common.
Señor, señor, cavarelle soldat, il est torero, et veut s'entendre, pour plaisir, disons, et comment.
And soon he is launching into one of the world's half-dozen best-known tunes. It is Escamillo's calling card and is popularly known as the Toreador's Song. It has the same huge vocal range, Paul Hume, critic of the Washington Post, famously remarked, as the equally unsingable American national anthem. It also has immense drive and animal force, allied to a rare narrative quality. because in addition to all the macho strutting, Escamillo gets to tell in some details the events of a bullfight.
Songe en combattant un noir te regarde et que l'amour t'attend. Toréador, l'amour t'attend.
Escamillo leaves. All his appearances in this opera are brief ones, and the criminal classes put in an appearance. There is a truly wonderful quintet now for a pair of smugglers, Don Cairo and Remondado, and their girlfriends, Frasquita and Mercedes, plus Carmen. The smugglers have in mind to do some dirty deeds, and amusingly they sing that when there are dirty deeds to be done, it is good to have a few women along. This quintet seems to me to be a musical first in some ways. It is breathtaking in its musical energy. It is funny. It requires great musicianship and is a general delight to the audience in the midst of sterner stuff. Let's just hear the opening moments of this musically scintillating quintet just to set the musical thematical material in mind. You need only a schoolboy knowledge of French to appreciate that when the smugglers say, "Nous avons besoin de vous," and the singers bat back and forth, de nous, de vous, de nous, de vous, we are in the presence of high musical comedy. Carmen, to everyone's astonishment, says she cannot join in the skullduggery because she has found true love. At this point, the other four, either literally or metaphorically, fall about the stage, because the thought of Carmen being faithful to any one man is just too funny for words. The smugglers move off, and we hear the offstage voice of Don José singing as he approaches the tavern. We have an extended scene now between Don José and Carmen. This is really the core of the opera, because it is in this scene that Carmen will turn all her charms on José, singing and dancing for him alone. But when duty calls, he will want to respond to it. She is all seductive charm, he, at the appropriate moments, is all sense of duty. Here is Carmen singing and dancing for José, but listen how cleverly, almost imperceptibly, the sound of bugles from the barracks intrudes on the rapture. As the scene develops, the bugles get louder. José pays them more attention at Carmen's expense, and she is enraged by this triumph of military duty over love. As a woman and as an outlaw, she is doubly offended.
Ce sont nos claireaux qui sont la retraite, ne les entends-tu pas? Bravo, j'arrive à faire, il est mélancolique de danser sans orchestre, et vive la musique qui nous tombe du ciel.
I suspect that for Carmen, the affair is over at this point. But when she accuses Don José of not loving her, he responds with one of the great tenor arias, La fleur que tu m'avais jetée. The sense of the aria is that he has kept the flower which Carmen had thrown to him in Act 1 close to him through the month in jail. The colour is now faded, but it is for him a symbol of their love. The aria makes great demands on the singer, emotionally and musically, because though Don José is the quintessential tenor héroïque, heroic tenor of French opera, Bizet asks him to be gentle, almost lyrical in this aria. Note especially that the aria is preceded by a short but very telling statement of the fate motif, which we heard in the prelude. The love versus duty dilemma is sold for Don José by the return of Zuniga, the sergeant we met in the first act. We learn that he is also a candidate for Carmen's love, or thinks he is. A confrontation leads to Don José striking Zuniga, and he is only prevented from killing him by the return of the smugglers, getting ready to set off on their expedition. Don José has burned his boats. After striking a superior officer, he has no choice now but to join the smugglers. The third act of Carmen takes place in the smuggler's lair, in the mountains near Seville. Bizet miraculously depicts the stark beauty of the countryside and demonstrates his skill as one of the great orchestral colorists in a lovely entr'acte which sets the scene for Act 3. The most important incident of the early part of this act comes when Frasquita and Mercedes are playing a semi-serious game of telling fortunes through the cards. Each predicts for herself a dazzling future involving rich suitors in precarious health. Let's hear the light-hearted side of what is known as the card trio as Mercedes and Frasquita shuffle and cut the cards. Melon, coupon. Carmen joins them to read the cards and draws diamonds, followed by spades, the death cards, and to a chilling reprise of the fate motif learns that first she is to die, then José. At this awful moment, Carmen has another of those marvellously sinuous, chromatic melodies, in which she accepts that it is impossible to avoid the fate the cards have decreed. En vain pour éviter les réponses amères. It is useless to try to avoid the card's response. Bizet now plays a card of his own, the contrast card, because onto this crime-ridden scene comes gentle, unspoiled Michaela, who is given a gentle, unspoiled aria, which is actually one of the glories of the lyric soprano repertory. She has come in search of Don José, and she sings, Je dis que rien ne m'épouvante. I said that nothing could frighten me, but being alone on these mountains terrifies me. The act continues with the return of Escamillo, who is rather improbably in the area, trying to round up some bulls for his next bullfight, and he encounters Don José, whom he has not previously met. José and Carmen are by this time, I suspect, past the point where counselling would do them any good, but Escamillo drives Don José over the edge when he tells him, not knowing his identity, that Carmen no longer loves her soldier boy. A fight ensues, and once again Don José comes very close to killing his rival. That makes 2 attempted murders and 1 probable murder, which is not bad for an ex-seminarian. Michaela is discovered hiding under a rock and explains to Don José that his mother is dying. Don José reluctantly agrees to accompany Michaela back to the village, an act of filial piety which, of course, wins him no points with Carmen. The simple country boy, the ex-priest, has become the raging bull. In brilliant contrast to the dark and gloom of the 3rd act, set in the mountains at night, the 4th act is all blazing light. The scene is set for death in the afternoon and takes place outside the Maestranza, the main bullring of Seville. The bustle and excitement is set at once, with a thrilling chorus of vendors, urchins and spectators. This is followed by a wonderful chorus, Les Voici, in which the crowd looks to the arrival of the picadors, the matadors and toreadors, and the excitement is miraculously conveyed in one of the most justly loved incidents in opera, sometimes called the March of the Toreadors. Carmen now enters, gorgeously dressed, and on the arm of Escamillo, with whom she has taken up. It is interesting to contrast the attitude to Carmen of the two rivals, Escamillo and Don José. We get the impression that for Escamillo, Carmen is just one in a line of conquests, and he has a casual, almost off-hand way of addressing her. Si tu m'aimes, Carmen.
Si tu m'aimes, Carmen, si tu m'aimes, Carmen, tu pourras tout à l'heure être fière de moi. Si tu
Escamillo goes on into the bullring to dispatch a few bulls, and Frasquita and Mercedes tell Carmen that Don José is lurking about, looking for her. Carmen goes out into the street to meet him. There is a world of difference between that conventional expression of love of Escamillo for Carmen and the impassioned, almost demented love of Don José. It is all over now, apart from the inevitable death in the sand, because when Carmen announces her intention of going to join Escamillo, Don José attempts to block her path. It is always a matter for debate between stage directors and singers performing the role of Carmen whether she is a murder victim or a suicide. One always feels that she could avoid her fate if she chose. But she is so convinced of the fatal power of destiny, as revealed in the cards, that she consciously walks towards Don José and to her death. Whatever her motivation, she utters a final cry of defiance and hurls at his feet the ring he had given her. And, superb dramatic touch this, as the crowd roars another victory for Escamillo in the bullring, José brutally stabs Carmen. As she dies, the orchestra thunders out, inevitably, the fate motif.
Je suis là, et te menacer, et toi
You can see, can't you, even in this short introduction, why Carmen is among the most beloved of operas, by performers and audience alike. It really has it all. An exotic setting, the spectacle of the bullring, ever-present menace, an intriguing heroine, a little too intriguing for Paris taste in 1875, humour, innocence, though not too much of it, and a first-class story. But the music. Oh, the music.